Thomas was buried on a Tuesday when the sky itself seemed to wear mourning. I stood at the graveside in my black coat, hands folded inside the muff he had given me on our first winter together. The wintry wind carried the scent of damp earth and lilies. The children arrived late, coats still carrying the scent of airport coffee. They hugged me quickly, eyes already moving past me to the house on the hill that had sheltered us for 49 years. That night they stayed. The rooms that had known only my quiet footsteps for months suddenly filled with their voices, their footsteps, their plans spoken in low, certain tones. They opened drawers to help sort papers. They stood in the library running fingers along leather spines as though testing fruit for ripeness. They measured the dining room table with their eyes and spoke of when it's ours. I made tea no one tasted. I sat in Thomas's chair and watched them move through our life like careful guests who believed the host had already left. By the end of the week they had walked every corridor. James spoke of turning the East Wing into a guest suite. Claire asked if I had ever considered something smaller, more manageable. They used gentle voices, the kind people save for the very old and the very confused. I smiled the small, harmless smile widows perfect. I said I was tired. I let them believe grief had made me soft. They left on Sunday evening promising to return soon to help with anything you need. I stood at the door until their car lights disappeared down the lane. Then I walked to the study, opened the drawer where Thomas kept his fountain pen, and laid my hand on the cedar box that had waited there, unopened, since the day he died. Some funerals end at the cemetery. Others only begin when the mourners start measuring the curtains. Winter settled hard and white. They came every Sunday now, bringing casseroles that went cold on the table while they walked the house with quiet purpose. James carried a leather notebook. He wrote figures beside the fireplace, measured the library shelves, photographed the wine cellar for inventory. Claire brought paint swatches and draped them across the sofa to see how the light falls. She spoke of when the house is ours as though the words were already fact. I watched from my chair by the window, hands folded over the same shawl I wore the day Thomas died. I let my voice drift when they asked questions. I let my eyes fill with tears at the right moments. I let them believe the fog was rolling in. They began finishing my sentences. They began speaking of we when they meant the house. They began leaving brochures for luxury retirement villages on the hall table beside my post. One May afternoon I found Claire in the attic with a tape measure and a calculator. She startled when the stair creaked. She smiled too brightly. Just seeing how much storage we'll have when you move, Margaret. Boxes marked Thomas's medals, wedding 1973, baby clothes lay open around her like small, quiet graves. I said nothing. I simply watched the dust settle in the torchlight and felt the house close its doors around me, patient and listening. That night I sat at the kitchen table long after they left. I laid my palm on the scarred oak where Thomas had carved our initials the week we moved in. I listened to the grandfather clock count seconds they believed were already slipping into their pockets. I began leaving drawers unlocked on purpose. I began letting envelopes pile up unopened. I began letting them think the will was a simple thing, already written, already theirs. Because some certainties are best allowed to grow tall and careless before the frost finally comes. September came in cool and deliberate. One afternoon I climbed the attic stairs to find the box of winter curtains I had promised the church sale. Behind the trunk that held our wedding album, wrapped in the same burgundy silk scarf I wore to Thomas's funeral, stood the small cedar box he pressed into my hands the night before he slipped away. I carried it downstairs and set it on the kitchen table beneath the lamp we had used for 49 years of shared breakfasts and midnight tears. The little gold key still hung on its ribbon beneath my blouse, warm against my heart every day since the funeral. The lid lifted with the softest sigh, as though the cedar itself had been waiting to breathe. Inside lay our marriage lines, the pressed white rose from my bouquet, and one thick cream folder sealed with burgundy wax. I broke the seal slowly. The codicil, drafted in 2019 but never signed in their presence. It amended the simple will they had seen. One line, written in Thomas's steady hand, changed everything. Should any child speak of my wife's fortune as already theirs before her own breath has ceased, the entire residue of my estate shall pass to the seaside haven for widowed women, to be held in trust by Margaret alone. Below the line, his note to me, dearest, if ever they forget who kept this house warm, let one word be enough. You will know which one. I read until moonlight laid silver across the table and Claire's paint swatches. Then I read again by lamplight while the wind tapped the window like small, patient fingers asking to be remembered. I closed the box, laid my palm on the warm cedar, and felt the house breathe with me for the first time since Thomas left. That night I telephoned Mr. Hargrove, the solicitor who had known Thomas since school. I asked him to come the following week for a small amendment. He arrived with his briefcase and his gentle eyes. I changed one word, from children to widows. I signed. He witnessed. The new will was lodged before sunset. Some evenings I walked the long hallway touching the walls he paneled himself. I left every light burning because darkness felt too forgiving. The gold key now hung openly against my heart like a second, steadier pulse. And every morning I laid the signed codicil beside my teacup and watched the light move across the single altered word that had waited patiently for the day they would finally say it aloud. I was no longer waiting to be measured. I was simply preparing the moment when one word would measure them. October turned the leaves the color of old pennies. I rose early, made coffee I barely tasted, and slipped the new will into the rosewood box each morning like a quiet prayer. I left the old, unsigned version on the desk in plain sight, the one they had all read and believed was final. They came every Sunday now, their footsteps surer on the stairs. James brought his architect friend to look at the light. Claire arrived with fabric books and paint cards. They spoke of knocking through walls, of installing a cinema room, of the swimming pool they would dig once everything is settled. I sat in my wing chair, hands folded over my knitting that never grew longer, and let them talk. I let my voice wander when they asked questions. I let my eyes fill with tears at the right moments. I let them believe the fog was rolling in. They began moving small things. A vase to make space for fresh flowers. Thomas's favorite chair to the attic for reupholstering. My writing desk temporarily to the guest room. I thanked them softly. I said the house did feel lighter. I let them believe they were already living here. One November afternoon I found James in the study with a measuring tape stretched across Thomas's desk. He looked up quickly. Just planning, Mum. Nothing definite. Claire added, we'll make sure you have a lovely suite on the ground floor when the time comes. I nodded, touched my temple as though the thought had already drifted away, and offered them tea they did not drink. That night I walked every room after they left. I touched the places where Thomas's chair had stood, the empty corner where the vase had been. I listened to the house breathe around me, wounded, but still mine. I began leaving drawers unlocked on purpose. I began letting dust gather on the mantel. I began letting them think the house was already slipping from my hands. Some evenings I sat at the kitchen table with the rosewood box open beside my teacup. I traced the single changed word with one finger and felt the years settle into something steady and cold, like ice forming beneath moving water. I was ready. Not angry. Simply ready the way winter is ready long before the first leaf dares to fall. It was the first Thursday in December, the night the wind rattled the windows like impatient fingers. I had gone to bed early, or so they believed. I left my bedroom door ajar and lay fully dressed beneath the quilt, the silver pen resting warm in my cardigan pocket. They arrived after supper, thinking the house asleep. I heard the front door close softly, the murmur of coats being hung, the creak of the third stair they always forgot. I rose without a sound and walked the cold hallway in my stockinged feet. I stood in the shadow beside the grandfather clock and listened. They were in the study, voices low but clear in the stillness. James spoke first. "Once Mum signs the will, we're set for life. The solicitor says she's ready. Just needs a little nudge." Claire laughed, soft and certain. "She won't even notice. We'll move her to the annex before spring. She'll think it was her idea." Matthew's voice, younger, eager. "And the vineyard shares? Straight to us?" James answered, "Everything. House, land, accounts. She's got no one else." A pause. The clink of crystal, Thomas's whiskey glasses, the ones they had already begun using. Claire again, closer now, just beyond the study door. "She's fading, poor thing. Won't be long." I stood very still. The hallway smelled of pine from the Christmas tree they had put up without asking. The clock ticked once, twice, 3 times. I felt no tears. Only the quiet opening of a door inside my chest that had been closed for years. I slipped the silver pen from my pocket. I pressed the tiny button on its clip. It began to record. They spoke for 23 more minutes, plans for extensions, holidays, university trusts for grandchildren who barely visited. Every word clear, every laugh soft with certainty. When their voices moved toward the stairs, I walked silently back to my room, closed the door, and lay beneath the quilt until their car lights swept across the ceiling and disappeared. I did not sleep. I sat at the little writing desk by the window and listened to the recording twice. Their voices filled the dark room like smoke. Then I opened the rosewood box, laid the new will beside the old, and waited for morning. I was ready. Not angry. Simply finished listening to children who had forgotten how to hear. I woke before dawn. The house was perfectly still, holding its breath with me. I rose, dressed in soft gray wool, and carried the rosewood box downstairs to the kitchen table where every important decision had ever been made. I laid out both documents side by side beneath the lamp, the old, unsigned will they believed was final, and the new one Mr. Hargrove had prepared exactly as Thomas wished. I opened the new will to the critical page. The line read, "All the residue of my estate I give to my children James, Helen, and Matthew in equal shares." I took Thomas's fountain pen, the same one he used to sign our marriage register, and changed one word. I crossed out children with a single, steady line. Above it I wrote, in the same careful hand I once used for school reports, "Widows." I signed beneath the alteration. I dated it. I pressed the small seal Thomas kept in the drawer for important letters. Then I telephoned Mr. Hargrove. He arrived at 8:30, briefcase in hand, eyes gentle. He witnessed the change. He sealed the document. He took both versions, the old for destruction, the new for immediate lodging. He asked if I was certain. I said only, Thomas always knew the hour. He left as quietly as he came. The house exhaled. I made tea I finally tasted. I sat at the table and listened to the recording one last time, every whisper, every plan, every laugh. I saved it to 3 separate places. Then I waited for the children to arrive with their gentle smiles and their forged concern. They came at 10, bearing croissants and sympathy. They laid the old will on the table for your signature, Mum, whenever you're ready. I smiled the small, harmless smile they knew so well. I took the pen they offered. I laid it down. I opened the rosewood box and placed the new will beside their breakfast plates. I pressed play on the small silver recorder. Their own voices filled the kitchen, clear, damning, proud. James reached for the document. Claire's hand flew to her mouth. Helen froze with a croissant halfway to her lips. I spoke for the first time that morning. My voice was quiet, steady, the same voice that once called them in from play when thunder rolled. "One word," I said. "That is all it took." I turned the page so they could see the single alteration, the ink still fresh. The silence that followed was not soft. It was the silence of a door closing forever on a room they had believed was already theirs. They say the kitchen remained perfectly still for a very long time after I pressed stop on the recording. 3 grown children and their spouses sat around the table where they had once colored with crayons, faces pale as the winter light outside. James tried to speak first. The words caught in his throat. Claire began to cry without sound. Helen stared at the single changed word as though it might bite her. I rose, gathered the rosewood box, and walked to the window. I looked out at the garden Thomas planted the year each of them was born. The roses were bare, but I knew they remembered. I did not turn around when I spoke. My voice was soft, steady, the same voice that once read them bedtime stories. You measured my life in square feet and share prices. I measured yours in love. Love, it seems, has a different scale. I heard chairs scrape. Footsteps. The front door closing with the quiet finality of a book no one will reopen. They never returned. Some evenings I sit at the kitchen table with the cedar box open beside my teacup. I touch the pressed white rose and feel Thomas's hand on my shoulder as clearly as the day he placed the codicil in my keeping. The farm still grows. The vineyard still ripens. The haven by the sea sends me photographs of widows who sleep beneath roofs we paid for. I sign every check with the same hand that once signed their school reports. People ask if I am lonely. I tell them loneliness is children who begin measuring your grave while you still draw breath. I have the house Thomas built, the land he walked, and the clearest title deed of all, his trust in me. The last laugh is never loud. It is the soft scratch of a fountain pen changing one word. It is the quiet closing of a kitchen door on faces that finally understood whose life they had been counting. It is an old woman walking her own hallway knowing every room still answers to the woman they tried to write out of her own story. If this story rested somewhere gentle inside you tonight, stay a while longer. The kettle is warm, the roses are sleeping, and there are many more evenings when a woman remembers she was always the sentence, never the footnote they tried to erase with careless ink. You are safe here. You are seen. And that, my dear, is the only signature that truly matters.